The Atari 2600 is a video game console created by Atari Incorporated. The 2600 was released September 11, 1977 in North America, 1978 in Europe, and October 1983 in Japan. When Atari Incorporated released the Atari 2600, it cost $199 American and shipped with 2 joystick controllers and 1 pair of conjoined paddle controllers. Also, the 2600 would release with the game Combat. Later in time, the 2600 would be released with Pac-Man. Atari Incorporated would sell 30 million units worldwide. The top-selling games for the 2600 were Pac-Man, which sold 7 million copies, Pitfall, which sold 4 million copies, Asteroids, which sold 3.8 million copies, Missile Command, which sold 2.5 million copies, Space Invaders, which sold 2 million copies. The reason why the Atari 2600 was originally created by Atari Incorporated was to compete with its competitor, the Fairchild Semiconductor, who created the Fairchild Channel F. Both companies were trying to create a popular video game console for the home. Fairchild Semiconductor would release their console first. When the 2600 launched, Atari Incorporated only sold 250,000 consoles worldwide. The reason for the low number of consoles being sold was because during this time period, Atari Incorporated, as well as Fairchild Semiconductor, and every other game company that was trying to dominate the home console market, were only trying to advertise and sell the game Pong as well as Pong machines. The result of trying to market Pong resulted in consumers around the world getting sick of Pong and not buying the Atari 2600 as well. In 1977, Atari Incorporated only sold 250,000 2600s worldwide. During this time period, the 2600 was made in Sunnyvale, California, which made console unnecessarily expensive and heavy. By 1978, Atari Incorporated would move the manufacturing of the 2600 to Hong Kong to make the consoles cheaper. However, in 1978, a dismal 550,000 units were sold worldwide. The result of these bad sales was that the founder of the company, Nolan Burnchill, would leave. However, despite bad sales numbers, things would drastically turn around for the Atari Incorporated as well as the 2600. By December of 1979, the 2600 was the best-selling Christmas present for that year. Also, the 2600 became the most popular home game console to that point in history. In that one-year span, Atari Incorporated would sell 1 million consoles, and by 1980, the company would sell over 2 million consoles, and the company would have a $2 billion profit. There are many factors that contributed to the 2600 becoming popular. The first reason is that consumers realized that the 2600 was more than just a Pong machine, and could also play many other different games. A second reason why the 2600 was successful was because Atari Incorporated would get licenses from big video game developers such as Namco and Tatio, and be able to port arcade classics to the 2600 such as Space Invaders and Pac-Man. The third reason how the 2600 became so popular was because manufacturing of the console itself and the games were cheap, which gave Atari the power to mass-produce consoles and sell them at a cheaper price. A fourth reason the 2600 rebounded so well was that Atari Incorporated was selling the 2600 in European markets and Asian markets. And despite troubling sales in both regions, it still made the 2600 well known worldwide. Even though Atari would sell many consoles and games till 1992, the company and the 2600 would use a lot of money and would lose a lot of popularity. There are many different reasons why the Atari and the 2600 lost popularity. The first reason being is once the 2600 became popular, Atari Incorporated would spend a great deal of profits on a huge research development facility. The problem with creating this large facility was that the company would try to create different projects that were not related to video games at all. Furthermore, most of the projects created at the facility would never see the light of day, which cost Atari Incorporated millions of dollars. A second factor which would cause the downfall of the 2600 was that many programmers at Atari Incorporated became agitated with the company for not crediting game developers for the games they were making. The result of this anger would lead to many Atari Incorporated programmers to leave the company and create their own companies for the 2600, which made the console lose popularity. Another reason why the 2600 would lose popularity is because Atari Incorporated would let a company called Mystique create pornographic games for the 2600. When these games came out, women and Native American right groups would protest these games and call for a national boycott of the 2600, which caused 2600 sales to plummet. The final nail in the coffin for both Atari Incorporated and the 2600 was that consumers would become irritated and disenchanted by how bad most of the 2600 popular games were. This irritation would lead to the 2600 falling out of popularity around the world. It eventually caused people to not buy games in America and around the world, which led to the 1983 video game crash. The Atari 2600 would not be discontinued until 1992. The reason why it was not discontinued until 1992 is because the console was cheap and so were the games, which gave Atari enough money to stay afloat. There are many different types of Atari 600s. The first Atari was heavy and had 6 switches on the front of the console. By 1980, the 2600 would have 4 switches in the front and 2 in the back. Also, the console would be all black. The second version of the console that would exist would be the Sears Telegames. From 1977 to 1983, Atari Incorporated and Sears would be business partners in the video game industry. This partnership would lead to Sears making the Telegames. The Telegames itself was a souped-up 2600 with 6 switches in the front and a Sears Telegames logo in the middle of the console. In Japan, the 2600 was called the Atari 2800. The 2800 had 4 controller ports. The controllers were all in one design, which was a combination of an 8-directional joystick and a 70-degree paddle. The console was also shaped like a wedge and had non-protruding switches. The final type of 2600 to be created was the Atari 2600 Junior. The Junior came out in 1984. The Junior was smaller and had a rainbow line in the middle, no switches, and push buttons. There are many reasons why the Atari 2600 is a historically significant console. The first reason is that it was Atari's best-selling console ever. Second, the 2600 would be one of the first game consoles to popularize console gaming in a home. A third reason why the console is important to video game history is that it was one of the very first game consoles to create political controversy and also cause a boycott by minority activist groups throughout the country. The fourth reason is that the console would indirectly create other game companies like Coleco and ColecoVision. Another reason this console is important is that when consumers rejected the 2600 and some of the shoddy games, it would cause the video game crash of 1983. This crash would lead to the decline of American games and consoles and lead to the rise of Japanese consoles and games. Another reason the 2600 is important is because the console would popularize games like Adventure, Pitfall, Haunted House, Demon Attack, and Atlantis. The final reason the 2600 is important is because it had Pac-Man and E.T., the extraterrestrial on it, which are considered to be some of the worst video games ever created on a console, which is very, very historically significant.